And we are live within the Fast Lane, the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix, as we count down to qualifying for the 2022 Formula One Heineken Australian Grand Prix at Albert Park later this afternoon. I'm your host, Matt Clayton, and joining me as he does on co-host on every four-wheel episode of the podcast is Michael Lamonato. Hello, Michael.
Hello, mate. Good to be back. Good to have F1 action back at Albert Park.
Fantastic to have it back. And also joining us as we look back at Free Practice 3 that just concluded about half an hour ago, we are very pleased to welcome former F1 racer. He's driven just about everything, really, so it's probably selling him a little bit short, but current Sky Sports F1 commentator and analyst Karun Chandhok. Karun, welcome back to Melbourne.
Thank you. Thank you very much. No, it's wonderful to be back, and I'm very glad you guys are letting us back into your country now. It's been great.
We're very glad we're allowed to let you back into our country, Karun. But let's start with what we've just had on track here with FP3. We had a session with Lando Norris topping the timesheets in a session that was red flagged at the end when the second Aston Martin went in the wall for the session. No lunch break for those guys. But we'll talk about some of the other teams as we go through the next 10 minutes or so. But McLaren, for Australian fans, it was pretty despondent after Bahrain. It was pretty grim. Saudi a little bit better. Is this just track specific here, or are McLaren edging their way back in towards that midfield fight? Because it's obviously good for us if they are.
Well, there's obviously lots of Lando Norris fans here. That's clearly why all these people are wearing orange this weekend. No, I think they think it's track specific when you speak to them. So we'll only find out when we go to the next one. The good news is they're up there, right? That's the main thing. I don't know if they will still be ahead of Ferrari and Red Bull when we get to qualifying. That would be a massive shocker. Yeah. But it's compared to where they were in Bahrain, they're a whole lot better, and that's good news.
Practice has been really difficult to read over the three sessions we've had so far. It felt like at the end of yesterday, Red Bull had kind of found a little bit of something. They felt a little bit more optimistic. Max Verstappen in particular thought that he'd gotten somewhere. Today, it seemed a little bit more difficult. Ferrari seemed a little bit more certain. And then, of course, we did have Lando Norris, McLaren cracking through there. Where do you feel like Red Bull is only an hour or so before qualifying now?
Behind Ferrari. The Ferrari just looks like a good car to drive. It looks driver-friendly. They're able to get a good time out of it on any tyre, in any track condition. I don't know what happened to the forecast because it said it was going to be warm and sunny today, but clearly that didn't work out. But the Ferrari works in any temperature. And I think the Red Bull, when it's a bit cooler, they're struggling to get the temperature they want into the tyres. So they'll be hoping for the sun to come through these clouds, but looking out across your stage, I think it's a bit optimistic.
In Melbourne, wait 5 minutes and we could get something completely different.
Well, there is that, yeah.
It's the best job in Melbourne is to be a meteorologist because you can just be wrong the entire time and everyone just shrugs their shoulders like, that's fine, that's just Melbourne for you. But Karun, the buzzword of 2022, porpoising. We've been discussing it so much. And what's really interesting is watching some of the onboards of the cars around this track. There's been so much discussion about how bad the Mercedes porpoising has been. It's clearly affecting what that car's doing. But then you look at Ferrari, there's no lack of porpoising going on there, but there are porpoises and there are porpoises, it seems.
Yeah, I think what people need to understand is actually there's a big difference between the cars bouncing on the straights and bouncing in the corners. And the Ferrari bounces an awful lot down the straights. And, as a racing driver, I would, any day of the week, take bouncing down the straights and giving me a bit of a headache and take some ibuprofen and paracetamol if you're going to be fast in the corners.
Yep.
And that's what Ferrari have got. What Mercedes have got is actually probably less bouncing down the straights, but the trouble is they carry on bouncing around the corners. And therefore, it's really simple. If you had a tennis ball, you rolled it along, it's just rolling consistently along a trajectory. If you had a car, a tennis ball just bouncing along, it's hard to see where it's going to land predictably, and that's the problem they've got. I think the problem for Mercedes is there's no quick fix.
Yes.
And for all the Lewis Hamilton fans hoping to see him win his 8th World Championship, with every race that Ferrari and Red Bull are scoring 25 points and he's not, and I see my friend Kevin Burrows here, who's a big Lewis Hamilton fan, waving up. It's a big problem because they're just giving away points and, tough times.
Just on Lewis as well.
Sorry, just on it, by the way.
Please.
Valtteri Bottas, what an inspired career timing that was, isn't it?
Talking of headlines,
how lucky did he get?
Incredible.
Very good call. Just on Lewis, and quickly on Lewis, this did feel like a comeback year, I suppose. Obviously, last year was very good for him, except for the very end. This was the year that things should have been made right, I guess, for Lewis Hamilton. Mercedes seemed very confident, always good in regulation changes.
We're not discussing Abu Dhabi.
No, I'm not discussing Abu Dhabi. I want to ask you,
Hamilton,
how must he be feeling now? 3 races in, it doesn't seem like, as you said, a quick fix. Even potentially seeing McLaren suddenly doing better must be very difficult for him now.
Well, and Alpine, they've done an amazing job. If you look at Jeddah, they were very strong. And all through this weekend, Fernando Alonso's hovered around the top 5. I think he was 3rd in that last session as well. So great to see Fernando up there. And it just means, right, there's more cars potentially costing Lewis points in this early part of the season. I think Mercedes will unlock the performance. It's a question of when and how many points they lose along the way.
You mentioned Alpine before. I've been feeling for Otmar Saf now these last couple of races, watching pink cars almost run into one another. I'm getting flashbacks to Spa with Perez and Ocon and Singapore and other such. They're not in pink this weekend, or mostly in pink, but that looks like possibly a podium winning car this weekend, particularly in the hands of Fernando. We know he's very, very good around here, but do you think that's put them ahead of that next tier for this weekend at the moment?
I think so. They seem to be ahead of the midfield. Well, it's a bit tricky because how do you define what the midfield is, I guess, as well.
It's everybody else, isn't it?
But the reality is they're closer to the front. And that's, that's where you would want them to be. That is a team that represents the 3rd biggest automotive manufacturer on the planet. So they kind of need to be up there at the sharp end, really. So, good to see him. And Fernando's super popular everywhere we go. He's a great driver. He's not lost any of his motivation. Honestly, I love watching Fernando drive. There's an energy about it. There's a buzz about the way he drives. And it's just exciting.
And one more before we let you go. Fernando Alonso is incredibly popular, including here. Maybe slightly less so, given he's the man nominally in the seat that might be Oscar Piastri's one day. We know that difficult situation there is the F2 champion not racing this year. Where do you think that's going?
Well, he was in the commentary box with us this morning for FP3, and he's a fantastic talent. He deserves an opportunity in Formula One. I'd love to see him get a chance in Formula One. The annoying thing at the moment is I think we're missing 2 teams. When I raced, I frankly got in because we had 13 teams on the grid.
Yes.
And we're missing that. We're missing an 11th and a 12th team where the F2 champion can come in. And I don't know if he will get that chance because we just heard Fernando saying yesterday he wants to carry on for 2 or 3 years. So you can sort of see Oscar just going into the ground and being a bit sad at that point, really. So I don't know. I hope he gets a chance. He deserves a chance. He's a very very good driver, and he's a lovely bloke, and deserves it. And he's a big cricket fan, so all of a sudden he's already gone up in my estimation.
We just need Chandhok F1 and Lamonato F1. There's your extra 2 teams, and we're all sorted. But Karun, I know you've got a.
Who are you going to sign?
I'll sign Oscar.
I've signed. Oh, you're going on Oscar.
I've got to go Oscar. Of course, I've got to go Oscar.
And.
I'll get Daniel Ricciardo.
Oscar,
Aussie dream team.
This is a very Aussie. It's a nationalistic team.
Yeah, I'm happy to own that. It's been a long time since we've had F1 drivers here. I want to take them all.
Fair enough.
Karun, I know you've got a massively busy afternoon ahead with qualifying.
Well, Ted's waiting for me in the pit lane. I've just had a text.
I've got
3 minutes to get to the pit lane and see if Aston have fixed their cars. So he's waiting for me there.
Run very fast, Karun. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Enjoy your weekend.
We're going to take a short break. Coming up after this, we're going to look at what happened in free practice 3 and ahead to qualifying in about an hour's time.
Oh, yes. And by the way, when you finish listening to the boys here on In the Fast Lane, head down towards Turn 1 and stop at Maui Gym to find your next pair of sunglasses like the one that Matt is going with right now. Nathan and his team are ready to help you find the perfect pair of shades. And Maui Gym have over 125 styles of sunglasses, all of which are polarised and protect from 100% of UVA and UVB rays. Maui Gym, are you wearing yours, Michael? Michael's wearing his now. Well done.
Of course I am.
Maui Gym, see the world like you've never seen.
If you're listening to us here on In the Fast Lane, you obviously love F1 and have a great taste in podcasts. Have you heard F1 Beyond the Grid? It's a podcast where you'll truly get to know the biggest names in F1. It's hosted by F1 journalist Tom Clarkson. Recent guests include 1992 world champion Nigel Mansell, Susie Wolff, and Ferrari's Carlos Sainz. Every week on F1 Beyond the Grid, a superstar driver, big boss, or brilliant brain from the world of F1 opens up about the highs and lows of their racing careers and their lives off track. You'll hear stories you've never heard before and insight you won't hear anywhere else. There are more than 150 episodes in the back catalogue. In-depth interviews with Daniel Ricciardo, Lando Norris, Mark Webber, Sebastian Vettel, Kimi Räikkönen, Lewis Hamilton, and many more. Why not give it a listen right here at Albert Park in the gaps between sessions? It's also perfect for your journey to work, while out walking, or your flight home from the Australian Grand Prix. You can find F1 Beyond the Grid on Apple, Spotify, and all other major podcast apps. It's also available on F1's YouTube channel. So once you've finished listening to us, search for F1 Beyond the Grid. It might just become your second favourite Formula One podcast, after In the Fast Lane, of course. Time for a bit of F1 trivia. Did you know the Australian Grand Prix was once held twice in a row and that the same driver won both races? In 1995, the Australian Grand Prix was the final race of the season. It was held in Adelaide. In 1996, the Australian Grand Prix was the first race of the season, held right here in Melbourne. The same driver won both. It was Damon Hill. So Damon Hill won 2 consecutive Australian Grand Prix, back-to-back, just 119 days apart. I mentioned Damon Hill because he's one of the hosts of the F1 Nation podcast, which you should definitely check out. It's hosted by Damon, with F1 reporters Tom Clarkson and Natalie Pinkham. They chat to a whole host of F1 guests from around the world, drivers, team bosses, and paddock insiders. The next episode will be out this Tuesday. They'll have the last word on what we hope will be a thrilling Australian Grand Prix here at Albert Park. Search for F1 Nation on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all major podcast apps, or F1's YouTube channel. Check out In the Fast Lane, the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix. Dedicated to Formula One and MotoGP, In the Fast Lane host Matt Clayton is joined by F1 journalist Michael Lamonato and MotoGP race winner Chris Vermeulen to interview some of the biggest names in world motorsport and update you on all the latest F1 and MotoGP racing news and talking points. You can find In the Fast Lane each week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is In the Fast Lane, the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix, live from Albert Park, with Matt Clayton and Michael Lamonato.
And we are back within the Fast Lane, live on stage here at the 2022 Formula One Heineken Australian Grand Prix. We've just had the completion of the third and final practice session ahead of qualifying this afternoon. And Michael, perhaps a surprise name at the top of the FP3 timesheet in Lando Norris, and we talked about this with Karun earlier. McLaren's certainly in much better form this weekend, but still a bit of a surprise to see Lando up there, isn't it?
Yeah, they're in much better form than we expected. We knew that this track was going to suit them a little bit better, at least in the scale that Saudi Arabia suited them better than Bahrain. This is obviously much better than Saudi Arabia went. Note of caution, look, they were still good in FP2. I think that is more promising than today's times because FP3 was still slower than the times we were setting yesterday. There's track evolution. The track will, well, it's hard to say, isn't it, at the moment, but will hopefully warm up in time for qualifying, move things back a little bit more to what we saw yesterday.
Yeah.
But undoubtedly, much more promising from the team because as much as track is playing a role, and I think Daniel said yesterday the track is probably the majority of the improvement here, it's too big of an improvement to just say rocking up to Albert Park has made the difference. They're clearly learning more about the car, as every team is. And it does give you a bit of optimism that there's a little bit more to unlock from that machine than I think even they suspected only a couple of weeks ago.
But what's weird was their first test in Barcelona was pretty good. And then the Bahrain test was a debacle. Daniel Ricciardo caught COVID, missed the whole thing.
Debacle. Debahrainical.
Oh, dear, it's a stretch even for me. It was a horrible test for them.
Yes.
Daniel Ricciardo in the hotel with COVID. Lando Norris did all 3 days. The temperature, the brakes were on fire. It was a disaster. The race wasn't a lot better, quite frankly. They were just completely invisible in that race. Saudi was better, but it's interesting, isn't it, that the track changes here, taking out some of the slow-speed corners. I know Daniel Ricciardo was involved in consulting on the design of this circuit. Did he know something here?
He must have seen something coming, didn't he? Yes, it suited them absolutely perfectly. And it does depend a little bit on the race. Looking at the practice, the long-run practice times from yesterday, they're not as optimistic as the single-lap times, but there is a lot of change to come this weekend, not only from the cars, but that track evolution to come back to that point. Well, I mean, we saw from Red Bull Racing as well, Karun touched on it now, that even relatively small changes are throwing teams out of the window. We are still early in this regulation cycle. There's still a lot to be understood. So maybe we can be optimistic about an unusually good, but not too good, but unusually good result.
I'm unusually optimistically good about Daniel Ricciardo's
Yes.
chances than I was probably on about Thursday. But this isn't exactly on the run sheet because we don't have one, Michael. But the session really was defined by 2 red flags. Unfortunately, they were 2 red flags for the same team. Sebastian Vettel shunting on the exit of the fast chicane, the cool chicane, as Oscar Piastri calls it, across the back of the circuit. And then Lance Stroll sticking the car in the wall down at turn 13, right at the end of the session. 2 hours between FP3 and qualifying. 2 chassis. Vettel's is a mess. Lance Stroll's probably just 1 corner knocked off that. But no lunch break for those guys. And look, not only are they slow, they're also in bits. It's been a pretty desperate start to the season, hasn't it, for Aston?
Yeah, it has. And you also be concerned, although I think they're going to be okay, but it's both the front and left corner of both cars, and we're sort of rough on spares at this point. All teams are a little bit rough on spare parts, so that's already 2 sets of front left spares out for Aston Martin. Looking at Sebastian Vettel's weekend, he's rocked up, he's had 2 races off, he set fire to his car, he's crashed the car, he's driven a scooter illegally down the track. It's like a Bucks party weekend for him. He's having that much, well, he's probably not having fun, is he? But it sounds like he should be having fun if you say it like that. But it does mean he's way on the back foot for qualifying. I mean, he had FP2 is the most important practice session, missed a lot of that because of the fire. The car's already slow to begin with, and he needs to learn why it's slow and why it works in the way it does or doesn't work. And then losing a whole bunch of time today. It's just going to be a very hard weekend for Aston Martin, isn't it?
After all the discussion about driver underwear in the driver's briefing yesterday, I'm half expecting Sebastian to end up in a fountain in only his underwear, and then it really is like a Bucks party, isn't it? But
will it be fireproof, though? That's the question.
Well, let's see. Let's see. But let's look at those timesheets. Probably no great surprise to see Charles Leclerc second for Ferrari. Sergio Perez, the leading Red Bull, in third, and Fernando Alonso lurking in P4 for Alpine. I love using that word lurking for Fernando because that's kind of what he does. Now, one of the 2 hosts of this podcast predicted before the weekend that Fernando Alonso would end up on the podium. That was me.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't remember predicting that.
I wasn't going to mention it if it was you. But I tell you what, that Alpine, we saw a bit of it in Saudi, but they were too busy squabbling amongst themselves to probably make the most of their pace. But that is a very quick car. And in the hands of Fernando Alonso, we know what he can do here. And as Karun was saying, I don't want to be the person to tell Fernando, look, can you just retire, please? Because he's going to be just as quick when he's 44, 45, or whatever it might be. I reckon they're on for a really, really strong qualifying.
Yeah, so you can just hear him now. I bet as he took his helmet off, he was just chanting, 2 more years, 2 more years. And that's going to be the case with Fernando Alonso. I had a suspicion that he was going to... I mean, look, it was only practice. We've got to see what's qualifying in the race. But the way that he and Ocon battled last time out, I just had this feeling he was going to turn up here and just reassert himself a little bit, just remind Esteban who he is. And I reckon Esteban's great, by the way, so I reckon he's going to be much closer in qualifying. But it's really great as well to see Alpine has taken a little bit more of a step forward than we thought after testing and after the first few races, because it's a team that should be competitive. It's a championship winning team in the past under a variety of different names. And after testing, we just sort of thought, looks a bit average again. Another average Enstone car, no wonder Daniel left. Now, though, in both of their hands, to be fair, but particularly this weekend so far in Fernando's hands, it looks like everything they were kind of promising. And that's, look, it's a phrase that we use a lot. It's good for the sport. Because not only is it a potential third contender maybe later in the year or next season, but they're competitive, and it's Alonso.
How far into Alpine/Renault's 5-year plan are we? Are we 8 years into their 5-year plan?
Matt.
L
plan for
plan.
Fernando.
Sorry.
Come on, in language, please.
Yes.
Actually, it's who's lost track. But they must be using a lunar calendar or something, because I don't think it's connecting with what I understand with linear time. But they're getting there.
Nice segue from you before. I know you meant it. Daniel Ricciardo, P6 on the timesheets.
Yes.
Reasonable distance behind Lando Norris, which is something we've said, unfortunately, a bit too much. But I'm really interested in his approach here this weekend, because he struggled in the past about trying to balance the need to prepare best for his home Grand Prix with the inevitable onslaught of commitments and just pressure that's placed on him. It's a delicate balance. Mark Webber used to struggle with it. It's hard when you're the only Australian in a big fishbowl like this. It's interesting this weekend, he's not doing the downtown hotel thing, bunkering himself down. He's got family here. Everyone's come across from Perth because they're allowed out of Western Australia. They're all staying in a house together. They're trying to keep it as normal as possible. He looked like a driver with the weight of the world on his shoulders after Bahrain, because he'd been sick, he was slow, the future outlook didn't look too good. he actually looks like he's got a bit of bounce in his step. And look, it's not a turnaround yet, but we might look back at this weekend as being the first pillar of the step in a turnaround. How have you seen his weekend? He's been pretty good.
Yeah, and it's a process, isn't it? I mean, if we talk about Daniel Ricciardo's issues last year, aside from the car problem, it was just a sort of a matter, you just felt like, and he sort of talked about this, hasn't he, that once you start to struggle a little bit and you can't grasp onto anything, then it's very easy to fall further down.
Yeah.
And this whole start to the season needs to be a process for him. COVID was a pretty frustrating blow, I imagine, taking him out of the car for testing, a little bit undercooked for Bahrain subsequently. I think this is a great step, as you said, sort of really bringing the family around him, something he noted he missed, of course, good Italian boy, why wouldn't you miss your family? Having them all around here just to build that baseline again will be really important, I think. So even before literally doing so this weekend, I feel like he's sort of started that process this season. And that is crucial. The mental game in a 23-race calendar around the world, the back end of the year in particular is really hard.
Yes.
Yeah, building those foundations now when he's got the opportunity to could be really crucial.
Reigning world champion Max Verstappen was P7 on the timesheets in FP3 for Red Bull. Never really got a soft tyre lap in. Had to abort a couple of them with a couple of moments down at turn 1 and turn 6. But the team we haven't mentioned yet, Mercedes, 8th.
Why would you? What did they do?
What did they do?
Nothing.
Well, this is what they did. 8th for Lewis Hamilton, 11th for George Russell. It's just not getting any better, is it?
No, and at least it's not getting any worse.
Well,
that's what I was thinking. It's not getting worse
glass
today.
half full, Michael Lamonato.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. The bottle's even a little bit more full than that, isn't it?
It is.
It is. It's difficult for them because, and I thought Lewis speaking last night was kind of instructive. They haven't brought anything new really to the car because they clearly have deeper problems than just incremental upgrades are going to solve.
Yep.
And it feels a lot like they're just at the limit of its potential, of this current iteration's car potential. We were saying yesterday, no matter what they do to the car, there's no more pace to be found. Inevitably, after they experiment with the car in Friday practice, they end up back where they started at the very beginning of FP1 because that's the maximum of the car. And that's the maximum of Lewis, sort of like middle of the top 10, a little bit lower than top 10. Probably will end up being the third quickest car in, well, maybe not because of Alpine, but thereabouts in the race and in qualifying. And that's just it. Until they can really grasp the problem and then bring the important upgrade package later, he's going to struggle through it. And I wonder, I don't think we should ever question Lewis Hamilton's motivation, but man, it must suck, right? Like competing for your 8th title last year and all of a sudden there you are in the middle of nowhere. No good.
You're half a lap away from being the most successful driver in the history of Formula One.
Yes.
And now you're thinking,
now look at you.
Am I going to make it into Q3?
Yes.
And the answer's probably not, to be perfectly honest.
No
But
good.
it's not looking great for them. They're slow. They know why they're slow, and they're not sure how to fix it.
Yes.
Which is it's kind of amazing to see how that's fallen off. But rounding out the top 10, his former teammate Valtteri Bottas, who's made the masterstroke move of the summer by going to AlphaTauri. Yuki Tsunoda, P10 for AlphaTauri. I mentioned Alfa Romeo for Bottas. Sorry, Yuki Tsunoda, his first time at this circuit, and I think there's 4 or 5 guys who've never raced here before. Nicholas Latifi's been here but hasn't raced here. But Yuki Tsunoda, he was probably top of my list for first guy to throw it at the fence this weekend because the one thing that Yuki does is he tries very, very hard and sometimes he tries a little bit too hard. And I'm wondering if the Yuki Tsunoda of last year would have come to Albert Park and perhaps overreached a little bit. So perhaps this is signs of progress because we know he's not slow.
No, he definitely doesn't lack speed. No. I think you've hit on something absolutely key there, and it's something that he said last year that he just needed to figure out his approach to the weekend. He'd go out in FP1 and try and blitz everything, and by the time he got to qualifying, it either already crashed or was about to crash. This year, and even in the latter half of last year, I think when he was given a bit of a sit-down and a talking to, he's just putting weekends together a little bit better. It's similar, actually, it reminds me a little bit of Carlos Sainz. Like, he puts weekends together, whereas Charles Leclerc's the guy who goes out there and really runs it ragged. But Leclerc, we know, is sort of on a little bit of another level compared to a lot of the drivers.
Yep.
And that's exactly the kind of progress that Red Bull likes to see inevitably, a driver who puts things together. And that's what we need to see from Yuki Tsunoda. If he's going to have a long career, the speed's there, like you say. If he puts weekends together, then there's no reason he can't be a successful Formula One driver.
Well, look, I think a successful afternoon for AlphaTauri would be Q3, but right now we're going to take a quick break on In the Fast Lane. We'll be back with more after this.
Oh, no, hang on, boys. The sun's starting to come out. The sun's starting to come out because, and you know what you need when the sun comes out? Sunglasses. When you finish listening to the boys here on In the... How's that for a segue? On In the Fast Lane, head down towards turn 1, stop at Maui Gym and find your next pair of sunglasses like the ones Matt and Michael are wearing. Or not. They've got 125 styles of sunglasses that you can choose from. There's not just 2 out there. Nathan, the team, they are going to help you find the perfect pair of shades. All of the sunglasses are polarised, protect from 100% of UVA and UVB rays. Maui Jim, see the world like you've never seen.
Time for a bit of F1 trivia. Did you know the Australian Grand Prix was once held twice in a row and that the same driver won both races? In 1995, the Australian Grand Prix was the final race of the season. It was held in Adelaide. In 1996, the Australian Grand Prix was the first race of the season, held right here in Melbourne. The same driver won both. It was Damon Hill. So Damon Hill won 2 consecutive Australian Grand Prix, back-to-back, just 119 days apart. I mentioned Damon Hill because he's one of the hosts of the F1 Nation podcast, which you should definitely check out. It's hosted by Damon with F1 reporters Tom Clarkson and Natalie Pinkham. They chat to a whole host of F1 guests from around the world, drivers, team bosses and paddock insiders. The next episode will be out this Tuesday. They'll have the last word on what we hope will be a thrilling Australian Grand Prix here at Albert Park. Search for F1 Nation on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all major podcast apps, or F1's YouTube channel. If you're listening to us here on In the Fast Lane, you obviously love F1 and have a great taste in podcasts. Have you heard F1 Beyond the Grid? It's the podcast where you'll truly get to know the biggest names in F1. It's hosted by F1 journalist Tom Clarkson. Recent guests include 1992 world champion Nigel Mansell, Susie Wolff, and Ferrari's Carlos Sainz. Every week on F1 Beyond the Grid, a superstar driver, big boss, or brilliant brain from the world of F1 opens up about the highs and lows of their racing careers and their lives off track. You'll hear stories you've never heard before and insight you won't hear anywhere else. There are more than 150 episodes in the back catalogue. In-depth interviews with Daniel Ricciardo, Lando Norris, Mark Webber, Sebastian Vettel, Kimi Räikkönen, Lewis Hamilton, and many more. Why not give it a listen right here at Albert Park in the gaps between sessions? It's also perfect for your journey to work, while out walking, or your flight home from the Australian Grand Prix. You can find F1 Beyond the Grid on Apple, Spotify, and all other major podcast apps. It's also available on F1's YouTube channel. So once you've finished listening to us, search for F1 Beyond the Grid. It might just become your second favourite Formula One podcast, after In the Fast Lane, of course. Check out In the Fast Lane, the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix. Dedicated to Formula One and MotoGP, In the Fast Lane host Matt Clayton is joined by F1 journalist Michael Lamonato and MotoGP race winner Chris Vermeulen to interview some of the biggest names in world motorsport and update you on all the latest F1 and MotoGP racing news and talking points. You can find In the Fast Lane each week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is In the Fast Lane, the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix, live from Albert Park, with Matt Clayton and Michael Lamonato.
And we are back within the Fast Lane live at the Albert Park Grand Prix circuit ahead of the 2022 Formula One Heineken Australian Grand Prix, just about 24 hours away. Jesus, good to say that. Joining us up on stage from Peking Duk, Reuben Styles, you're headlining the AusGP Sessions concert tonight in M Lane from 7 p.m, but you've had quite a day, haven't you?
It's been pretty crazy, I'm not going to lie. Getting up at 8 a.m. to do a hot lap in the Audis. It's been a wild ride. I feel like I'm high as a kite on just good times.
High as a kite on good times. Well, it's good going for a song, actually.
Yeah.
Tell us about the track when you're out on it in a very, very fast car and how that just totally changes your perspective on what you're watching.
Man, I really now sense the danger because when you're coming down the straight, you're like, you're going... the Audis, they go like 240 or 250, not 300 or anything like that. But you think, okay, it's time to start braking. And then it keeps going. And then they're still not braking. And you see the wall coming. And they're still not braking. And then before you know it, it just happens all in like 0.5 seconds and you're turning. And it's like, it's terrifying.
It's like if you drive around the roads in a normal time of year, it's like the difference. You know when you step on an escalator and it's not moving and your body just sort of, your brain does this? It's the same thing. If you've driven on these streets and then all of a sudden you're in a hot lap, you just can't process it. Your brain is just all over the shop.
Yeah, it's more scary than skydiving, without a doubt.
Wow.
I'd say there's, and just like you feel like, why isn't the car slipping out right now?
Yeah, that's it.
But it stays on.
But isn't the thing, though, it's not the acceleration that you remember, it's the braking. You can't believe how deep you go into a corner. It's like, you aren't going to make... Oh, we've made the corner. And that happens every single... So I did the speed comparison a couple of years ago, and I thought, we aren't going to make it past turn one. Forget the other 15 corners at that point. I'm not getting past turn one, but it's just absolutely remarkable.
My life flashed before my eyes.
Completely.
14 times, 14
But
corners.
it's
14
been
times.
such a sick weekend. Yeah, we got to also do a little garage tour of Williams. Got to meet Fernando Alonso and Esteban Ocon. And so I'm repping Alpine all weekend now. They're my boys. And
Yeah.
Well, you're a big Oscar Piastri fan, and I reckon you've picked a pretty good horse there based on what he's done pre-F1. He is going to be, once he gets his backside in a Formula One car.
he's going to slay. He's
Yeah.
going to straight up slay. Aussie P, wherever you are, I love you.
He's out there listening somewhere. Tell us about, you mentioned Fernando Alonso, Esteban Ocon. I mean, Alonso's one of the greatest all time. Esteban Ocon, it's weird to call him a young gun. He's been around for a while, but he's still pretty young and he's a bit of a gun.
Grand Prix winner.
With a Grand Prix win under his belt.
Absolutely. How did you find them? What was it like to chat to them?
It was cool. I got to just sort of say, I mean, I was obviously very nervous and a bit excited and, you know, it was hard not to get too excited, but I was just asking them silly questions like, oh, so 4 DRS zones. I was making the worst chat ever. And I think they liked it. They were like, yeah, 4's crazy, but it's good. And I think they just removed one of the DRS zones.
They had. So you weren't even current.
Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, I'm on trending topics with them. You know,
Absolutely.
we talk about what's going on.
The unusual thing with Esteban, when you meet him, you're thinking, you're way too tall to be a Formula One driver. That's the thing you most notice with him. He just doesn't fit the description at all, does he?
Right, yeah. He doesn't look... I mean, because Fernando Alonso, because I see him as a god, I was expecting this giant to walk into front of me, and I was like looking up, and I'm like, where is he? Oh, he's down
You missed
there.
him. Yeah, completely. Just completely missed him.
It was amazing. It was such a crazy experience.
And Oscar, obviously, I mean, he's our next F1 hope. He's really... He's much more outgoing than I remember him even last year. He feels like he's really grown into that Formula One driver vibe. It feels like he's ready. He should be suiting up, right? Like when you go and chat to him, it feels like he should be out there.
I mean, that's what everyone says. They're like, why the hell is he not on the track right now? But, you know, he's doing the right thing, you know, playing the long game. He's going to be in, hopefully, next year. Who knows?
Yeah, well, you can afford to play the long game when you've just turned 21 years old. But the guy... God, I wasn't ready for that at 20, I'll tell you that much. But the guy's pedigree, the only two guys that have won F3 and F2 consecutive years, Charles Leclerc, who's a Formula One Grand Prix winner and probably a world champion in the making, and George Russell, who might be. And if that's the sort of company we're talking about... You know, Oscar comes into Formula One with a much more impressive junior pedigree than Daniel Ricciardo and than Mark Webber. And they're the two guys that we've had on the grid since Melbourne's had this Grand Prix in the last 25 years.
Oh, you're giving me tingles right now.
Yeah.
Oh, my giddy gosh.
He is absolutely on the right path, right?
Yeah, 100%.
He's on the path to glory.
Let's hope so.
Absolutely. It's been great. It's been an incredible weekend so far. You've certainly been enjoying it. We've all been enjoying this weekend. Even the weather's sort of coming good again a little bit after the last couple of days. But there have been so many people. Even yesterday on a Friday, we had more than 100,000 people rock up.
Crazy.
You've obviously, you know, a live events guy, and it's what it's all about. It's been a really difficult 2 years. What's it like to get back to events massive like this? You've obviously done some already before you made it to the Grand Prix. To just see people having a good time again.
Yeah, to think that this is the new normal again, like coming back to this, it's crazy. But yeah, after 2 years of no gigs and, you know, it's really nice coming back to, you know, getting paid and getting money again. But obviously...
I hear.
Yeah. It's a good thing.
But, I mean, you can't help but get a little bit of that social anxiety when you're surrounded by people. And it's like, all right, here we go. And then you have this... I don't know, weird experience afterwards where you sort of feel like you need to be home alone for like a few weeks in your own personal lockdown. Yeah. But no, it's so great. I really hope we never go back into that.
Yeah, hear you there. Now, obviously, one of the things that has happened pretty much since we led this alternate existence in Australia for quite some time, Drive to Survive's taken Formula One to places in popularity stakes.
100,000 on a Friday.
Yeah, 112,000 on a Friday. There's your Drive to Survive census right there. And look, because I'm old and I've been at this event for a long time, I have never seen a Friday like it felt like a race day yesterday. And you've got to put so much of that down to the whole Drive to Survive effect. I'm assuming that you've watched every episode.
Yeah, I haven't done the new season yet,
Ooh.
but yeah, I have watched all the others. And to be fair, that is what got me into F1. So I'm one of the converts from Drive to Survive. But you can see it out there. It's not like
100%.
sport enthusiasts only.
So what was the thing that surprised you about it most once you got to sort of find out a bit about these drivers and the lives that they lead? Because Michael and I know this from a different perspective from working from the media side for quite some time. But for someone like yourself, what was the thing you're just like, wow, okay, what is it
Well,
about this
apart
race?
from Fernando Alonso's height, I'd say
Yeah, other than that.
the most surprising thing, I guess, would just be seeing, just seeing how late they break this morning. That's all I can think about.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's so many things in the sport which just blow my mind every time. And doing the walkthrough through the Williams garage today, I just said garage.
Garage. In the garage.
But like there was this room where the battery is kept, and it's like Area 57. Like it's fully contained and wrapped, and like she pointed at the door, but she didn't touch the door. I was like, the battery has such a high level of contain. Like I can't believe that. And also just finding out today that to transport the cars from country to country, the car just goes into all these tiny little boxes.
Incredible.
I could not believe that. I was like, surely they didn't used to do this.
How much of a different perspective? I mean, the battery is a great story. Walking through the Williams garage, seeing, there are back at base, obviously hundreds of people. Here there are about 80 people all working on essentially one car to send around a track, one driver. What's it like? That level of organisation is something most people don't get to see.
Yeah, it makes me feel like Team Peking Duk needs a few more people,
You need a battery in a storeroom for it as well.
We need an Area 57 section for something that we can pretend is really dangerous and from out of this planet. Hey, hey, brother.
Reuben, we know you've got a busy afternoon ahead of tonight, but look, we will wrap things up there. For everyone listening, remember to head over to M Lane for a huge Saturday night AusGP session with Nixon playing at 6 p.m. and then Peking Duk from 7:15. Reuben, it's been great to meet you this afternoon. Thanks for stopping by.
Thanks for having me, boys.
Thanks,
Mate.
We'll be back with more in the Fast Lane with Molly Taylor coming up shortly.
Oh, it is coming up shortly. But when you finish listening to the boys here on In the Fast Lane, head towards Turn 1 and stop at Maui Gym to find your next pair of sunglasses, like the ones that Matt's actually going to have a go at wearing. Michael's will put it on his head in a minute. They're wearing them right now. Nathan and his team are ready to help you find the perfect pair of shades, and Maui Gym has over 125 styles of sunglasses, all of which are polarised to protect from 100% of UVA and UVB rays. Maui Gym, see the world like you've never seen. If you're listening to us here on In the Fast Lane, you obviously love F1 and have a great taste in podcasts. Have you heard F1 Beyond the Grid? It's the podcast where you'll truly get to know the biggest names in F1. It's hosted by F1 journalist Tom Clarkson. Recent guests include 1992 world champion Nigel Mansell, Susie Wolff, and Ferrari's Carlos Sainz. Every week on F1 Beyond the Grid, a superstar driver, big boss, or brilliant brain from the world of F1 opens up about the highs and lows of their racing careers and their lives off track. You'll hear stories you've never heard before and insight you won't hear anywhere else. There are more than 150 episodes in the back catalogue. In-depth interviews with Daniel Ricciardo, Lando Norris, Mark Webber, Sebastian Vettel, Kimi Räikkönen, Lewis Hamilton, and many more. Why not give it a listen right here at Albert Park in the gaps between sessions? It's also perfect for your journey to work, while out walking, or your flight home from the Australian Grand Prix. You can find F1 Beyond the Grid on Apple, Spotify, and all other major podcast apps. It's also available on F1's YouTube channel. So once you've finished listening to us, search for F1 Beyond the Grid. It might just become your second favourite Formula One podcast, after In the Fast Lane, of course. Time for a bit of F1 trivia. Did you know the Australian Grand Prix was once held twice in a row and that the same driver won both races? In 1995, the Australian Grand Prix was the final race of the season. It was held in Adelaide. In 1996, the Australian Grand Prix was the first race of the season, held right here in Melbourne. The same driver won both. It was Damon Hill. So Damon Hill won 2 consecutive Australian Grand Prix, back-to-back, just 119 days apart. I mentioned Damon Hill because he's one of the hosts of the F1 Nation podcast, which you should definitely check out. It's hosted by Damon, with F1 reporters Tom Clarkson and Natalie Pinkham. They chat to a whole host of F1 guests from around the world, drivers, team bosses, and paddock insiders. The next episode will be out this Tuesday. They'll have the last word on what we hope will be a thrilling Australian Grand Prix here at Albert Park. Search for F1 Nation on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all major podcast apps, or F1's YouTube channel.
Check out In the Fast Lane, the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix. Dedicated to Formula One and MotoGP, In the Fast Lane host Matt Clayton is joined by F1 journalist Michael Lamonato and MotoGP race winner Chris Vermeulen to interview some of the biggest names in world motorsport and update you on all the latest F1 and MotoGP racing news and talking points. You can find In the Fast Lane each week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is In the Fast Lane, the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix, live from Albert Park, with Matt Clayton and Michael Lamonato. Time for a bit of F1 trivia. Did you know the Australian Grand Prix was once held twice in a row and that the same driver won both races? In 1995, the Australian Grand Prix was the final race of the season. It was held in Adelaide. In 1996, the Australian Grand Prix was the first race of the season, held right here in Melbourne. The same driver won both. It was Damon Hill. So Damon Hill won 2 consecutive Australian Grand Prix, back-to-back, just 119 days apart. I mentioned Damon Hill because he's one of the hosts of the F1 Nation podcast, which you should definitely check out. It's hosted by Damon with F1 reporters Tom Clarkson and Natalie Pinkham. They chat to a whole host of F1 guests from around the world, drivers, team bosses and paddock insiders. The next episode will be out this Tuesday. They'll have the last word on what we hope will be a thrilling Australian Grand Prix here at Albert Park. Search for F1 Nation on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all major podcast apps, or F1's YouTube channel. If you're listening to us here on In the Fast Lane, you obviously love F1 and have a great taste in podcasts. Have you heard F1 Beyond the Grid? It's the podcast where you'll truly get to know the biggest names in F1. It's hosted by F1 journalist Tom Clarkson. Recent guests include 1992 world champion Nigel Mansell, Susie Wolff, and Ferrari's Carlos Sainz. Every week on F1 Beyond the Grid, a superstar driver, big boss, or brilliant brain from the world of F1 opens up about the highs and lows of their racing careers and their lives off track. You'll hear stories you've never heard before and insight you won't hear anywhere else. There are more than 150 episodes in the back catalogue. In-depth interviews with Daniel Ricciardo, Lando Norris, Mark Webber, Sebastian Vettel, Kimi Raikkonen, Lewis Hamilton, and many more. Why not give it a listen right here at Albert Park in the gaps between sessions? It's also perfect for your journey to work, while out walking, or your flight home from the Australian Grand Prix. You can find F1 Beyond the Grid on Apple, Spotify, and all other major podcast apps. It's also available on F1's YouTube channel. So once you've finished listening to us, search for F1 Beyond the Grid. It might just become your second favourite Formula One podcast, after In the Fast Lane, of course. Check out In the Fast Lane, the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix. Dedicated to Formula One and MotoGP, In the Fast Lane host Matt Clayton is joined by F1 journalist Michael Lamonato and MotoGP race winner Chris Vermeulen to interview some of the biggest names in world motorsport and update you on all the latest F1 and MotoGP racing news and talking points. You can find In the Fast Lane each week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is In the Fast Lane, the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix, live from Albert Park, with Matt Clayton and Michael Lamonato.
And we are back within the Fast Lane live here at the 2022 Formula One Heineken Australian Grand Prix. We're joined by, I don't really want to sell her short, or just call her Australian off-road racing champion, Molly Taylor. Molly, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I didn't want to sell you short, but it would have taken the rest of the podcast if we'd read your entire CV. But
You don't want to embarrass me.
no, I won't do that. But let's talk about your year this year. First Australian woman to take on the Dakar. That's no small undertaking. Literally the biggest race in the world. Tell us about that, because the challenge, it's daunting just thinking about it. What was it like doing it?
Yeah, the Dakar's unreal. I think it's something every January at home, since I can remember we would watch the Dakar. I'm
Yep.
sure there's a lot of people in the same boat,
Same,
because it's like you go and live in another planet for 2 weeks and it's 8,500 kilometres through the desert, every kind of terrain you can imagine. And yeah, you really are out there against the elements all day, every day in some pretty extreme environments. And it was an incredible adventure. One of those things where, when it's going well, it's amazing. And when you're having a bad day, it's
as bad
about
as
the
it
worst
gets.
day in motorsport that you've ever had. But it's just an incredible experience.
It is. I mean, you're background is rallying, you're a rally champion, you've done a lot of off-road stuff. The scale of that event, though, is just something completely different, as you said. Tell us about, maybe you're 10 days in, something's going well, something's maybe going a little bit bad in the middle of the day. Like, just how physically grueling is it to go through that event?
Yeah, I mean, I think 10 days in, we had a little excursion and dropped about 3.5 hours on day 4.
That's a little excursion.
A little excursion. Yeah, we had to wait for our support truck to come, repair the car, and then do 200 kilometres in the sand dunes in the dark, which was interesting.
Wow.
And then I think by about day 10, we had made it back into the top 10, which has kind of been the target. And so it would have been a good fight back and good fun, few days trying to get some good clean days under our belt. And then I think it was about day 10, I hit a rock and ripped the wheel off again. And then we had the whole, repair the car and on the side of the road. And we think we only dropped an hour and a half that time, which in any other motorsports just seems incredible.
Yeah.
So day 10 was probably not a good one to ask me about because I'm pretty sure that's where
it was a random pick. I didn't mean to pick day 10. It's just a nice round number.
But yeah, you're
just
right.
don't
It's
do it
just, you've got to be, you're doing 300 to 600 or 500 kilometres of competitive stages and a few hundred kilometres of just transporting to drive to the stage on either side of that. So you're in the car all day, every day. And the terrains you've never been there before, so you're navigating like orienteering. So you're going on like a bearing of 180 degrees for 3 kilometres, and then you've got to switch to a bearing of 240 degrees and try and navigate. So the terrain, you've got to pick your path. You've got to go as fast as you can because it is a race, but you've got to manage the car, look after the car, and be aware. So you've really got to have that concentration. So on point for every single kilometre because there's rocks and sand and camels and, literally everything. So, yeah, it's that relentless level of concentration. You've got to be able to be just as sharp as you are on day 10, day 14 as you were on day 1.
I think they released the camels here on lap 20 of the Grand Prix, don't
Do they?
Yeah.
Any particular part of the track?
Yeah. Oh, no, that's
That would
random.
be interesting.
It's
They could probably just go underneath them in between the legs.
Release the camels. It's just a red button. Someone pressed it. Molly, look, Mum, successful rally driver. Obviously, you come from a rallying background, winner of the ARC. Tell us about your motorsport upbringing and how early it started, if you can even remember a time where there wasn't any, because there probably wasn't really any other career path you could have taken. It was kind of predetermined, wasn't it?
Well, I have an older sister and she's a barrister, so
there you go.
definitely, we call her the white sheep of the family.
I was going to say.
My mum's actually here. I told her to come and watch me, but I can't see her, so...
Oh, come on, Mum.
Thanks, Mum. But, Mum was a professional co-driver, so for me, that was all I knew growing up. So I think that had a great impact on me when I did want to get involved a bit later on. She taught me so much just through watching her compete, watching what it takes to compete at a professional level and the skills and relentless drive that she has and still has. So, that was very fortunate for me. But, I didn't get involved till I got my licence for the road and my dad actually made my sister and myself go to a rally school that he was running at the time and just wanted us to be competent drivers. So drive, a manual car, get a car out of a slide, all that sort of car control to learn. And that was the first time I actually drove a rally car myself and was like, wow. And I went from there.
We're obviously here at a circuit event and people maybe don't appreciate just how different circuit racing, there are so many different disciplines, but let's say circuit racing, rally racing, what are the key skills that really pull apart a great rally driver?
Yeah, it's great questions. Rallying, unlike a circuit, in a typical rally, it's up to 300 kilometres made up of stages. So a bit like Tour de France, where it's kind of A to B and that time gets added to the next stage. It's A to B and you have a system called pace notes. So there's 2 of you in the car, which is another key difference. And basically you write this kind of shorthand description of the track and then you're trying to drive through the forest and all the unknown elements that means in terms of the surface and the conditions, and you don't know all of that until you get there. And you're trying to sort of commit to every corner as much as you can, like you would on a circuit, to be as fast as you can. But obviously you don't know every corner, you don't know every braking point, or you don't know exactly where every apex is. So it's it's a bit more being adaptable. Having good car control is really important, probably the fundamental thing. So you can manage the car, because a lot of times, if a corner tightens or opens and things like that. So to be able to have that control of the car is probably the most fundamental thing. And then having that relationship with the co-driver and being able to then translate what a piece of dirt road looks like into some sort of system that allows you to know how fast to go around a corner you can't see.
Let's change tack a little bit and talk about Extreme E, another one of your accomplishments, the maiden Extreme E champion, the inaugural champion. Completely different series again, though. A little bit rally, a little bit rally cross, some completely different terrains as well. Take us through that first season, because it was new for everybody, and of course you emerged on top of everyone.
Yeah, so to be involved in Extreme E is amazing. It's an incredible concept to take these basically all-electric SUVs to all these remote corners of the country, and as you say, it's a bit like rallycross, so it's kind of head-to-head, five cars on the desert in the in the gravel, in sand or whatever terrain that we come across. So to be involved in that in the first series was incredible, and the names of the drivers, Carlos Sainz Sr. just in the paddock. He's one of the drivers. Sebastian Loeb, another one of the drivers. So some of my rally heroes there, and then a lot of F1 team bosses. So Lewis Hamilton's got a team. My boss is Nico Rosberg. Jenson Button also has a team. So kind of be in that world was very eye-opening, and pretty like, I guess, you have this sort of moment that it just seems a bit surreal. So to be able to be there and involved, and then for us to win the championship was very cool.
Yeah, it makes for great TV too. I think it's just a fantastic.
Their drone operator is just
might be the hero of the series.
Our hero of motorsport.
The locations are just breathtaking.
Unreal.
Yeah.
Molly, before we finish up here, I know you're working with the FIA Girls on Track initiative to raise awareness and encourage girls through STEM pathways. We've recently had Christina Emanuelidis from the Alfa Romeo team on the podcast talking about her journey from a school that is pretty much over near turn 6 of the Albert Park Grand Prix circuit to get over to work in Hinwil in Switzerland. But how have you seen that grow in recent years? And, I'm the father of a 16-year-old daughter who's got her own aspirations with things. How important are programs like this to encourage girls to get more involved?
Oh, they're incredibly important, and I think it's something that I didn't really realise until I started working with the Girls on Track initiatives, and from seeing young girls come up to you at rallies, because for me, I was so lucky that I had that role model and I had that visibility. So when I wanted to start getting involved in rallying, of course, there's not as many females involved, it's a difficult sport and all of those things, but I had this shining example of how possible it is if you're good and if you want it enough. So I didn't appreciate at the time how important that was for me and how lucky I was. So to now be able to work with these initiatives to appreciate and knowing full well how important visibility is for younger females. I don't think it's that any young girl sitting at home and someone saying you can't do it, but when everywhere you see, you don't see anyone doing it. It's just a natural, subconscious or conscious bias that you develop just from what you see. So to be able to have that visibility and through these programs grant that accessibility is so important, and we've seen from the program just how much we're growing that participation, and to see some of those girls come through the program and make connections in the sport and start doing work experience and taking that next step is unreal.
Well, and also paying it forward for the generation that comes after them. I think it's a hugely important stepping stone for that. But Molly, really appreciate your time here on the podcast this afternoon. Thanks for stopping by.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be back with more in the Fast Lane after this short break.
If you're listening to us here on In the Fast Lane, you obviously love F1 and have a great taste in podcasts. Have you heard F1 Beyond the Grid? It's the podcast where you'll truly get to know the biggest names in F1. It's hosted by F1 journalist Tom Clarkson. Recent guests include 1992 world champion Nigel Mansell, Susie Wolff, and Ferrari's Carlos Sainz. Every week on F1 Beyond the Grid, a superstar driver, big boss, or brilliant brain from the world of F1 opens up about the highs and lows of their racing careers and their lives off track. You'll hear stories you've never heard before and insight you won't hear anywhere else. There are more than 150 episodes in the back catalogue. In-depth interviews with Daniel Ricciardo, Lando Norris, Mark Webber, Sebastian Vettel, Kimi Raikkonen, Lewis Hamilton, and many more. Why not give it a listen right here at Albert Park in the gaps between sessions? It's also perfect for your journey to work, while out walking, or your flight home from the Australian Grand Prix. You can find F1 Beyond the Grid on Apple, Spotify, and all other major podcast apps. It's also available on F1's YouTube channel. So once you've finished listening to us, search for F1 Beyond the Grid. It might just become your second favourite Formula One podcast, after In the Fast Lane, of course. Time for a bit of F1 trivia. Did you know the Australian Grand Prix was once held twice in a row and that the same driver won both races? In 1995, the Australian Grand Prix was the final race of the season. It was held in Adelaide. In 1996, the Australian Grand Prix was the first race of the season, held right here in Melbourne. The same driver won both. It was Damon Hill. So Damon Hill won 2 consecutive Australian Grand Prix, back-to-back, just 119 days apart. I mentioned Damon Hill because he's one of the hosts of the F1 Nation podcast, which you should definitely check out. It's hosted by Damon with F1 reporters Tom Clarkson and Natalie Pinkham. They chat to a whole host of F1 guests from around the world, drivers, team bosses and paddock insiders. The next episode will be out this Tuesday. They'll have the last word on what we hope will be a thrilling Australian Grand Prix here at Albert Park. Search for F1 Nation on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all major podcast apps, or F1's YouTube channel. Check out In the Fast Lane, the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix. Dedicated to Formula 1 and MotoGP, In the Fast Lane host Matt Clayton is joined by F1 journalist Michael Lamonato and MotoGP race winner Chris Vermeulen to interview some of the biggest names in world motorsport and update you on all the latest F1 and MotoGP racing news and talking points. You can find In the Fast Lane each week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is In the Fast Lane, the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix, live from Albert Park, with Matt Clayton and Michael Lamonato.
Welcome back to In the Fast Lane live at the Albert Park Grand Prix circuit as we count down to qualifying for the 2022 Formula 1 Heineken Australian Grand Prix in a tick over half an hour's time. Michael, the question that I want from you answered is, who is going to be on qualifying? Because the best thing about being a print journalist at the Australian Grand Prix for most of the last little while is you could write, Lewis Hamilton has taken pole for the Australian Grand Prix by a margin of X, because he's been on pole here the past 6 times in Melbourne, and I don't want to go out on a limb, it's not going to be 7.
You're going to say that?
Right now.
You confident?
It's not happening.
Yeah, you're probably right, aren't you? It's tough to call because we've seen so many different signs over the last couple of days. You know, I'm really tempted to just say Charles Leclerc. That seems like a pretty obvious pick. The Red Bull's theoretically quicker, and the sun coming out is going to help them.
I agree.
But Sergio Perez was quicker today, and Max Verstappen seemed very uncomfortable with his car. First oversteer, then understeer. They still don't have a grasp of how that car's meant to work fully around this track, despite looking more promising yesterday. So in the absence of that strong sign, even though I think they will be better, I'm just going to go with the easy one and say Charles Leclerc.
Just to contradict you, I'm going to say Max Verstappen. I actually don't believe myself. I think it will be Charles Leclerc for the reasons that you mentioned. But I think something that's going to happen in this session, there's going to be a lot of mistakes in the use of DRS. Obviously, this could be a red flag interrupted session. So a lot of the time, it may be where you are and what you've got banked may determine what you get out of a session, particularly Q1 or Q2. So there could be a couple of surprises. Looking further into the crystal ball, what's a good result for Daniel Ricciardo this afternoon? His first Q3 of the season, is that achievable?
Q3 would be a very good result, I think. I mean, they've shown the pace in practice, at least, that it is possible in the sense that it could be on the table. It doesn't mean it's a given in the way that we've perhaps become used to. I think he's good. I mean, especially considering it's the Australian Grand Prix, he's going to want to make Q3. But, you know, again, we put a lot of a dampener on McLaren's results so far this weekend because I think particularly this morning they look better than they really should be. It'll be interesting to see where that car actually lands at the end of the day.
Well, it's been tough for Daniel in qualifying. 18th on the grid in Bahrain and then qualified 12th in Saudi Arabia. Copped a 3-place grid penalty for impeding Esteban Ocon in that session. So hasn't managed to get himself into Q3 yet. Hopefully that's the afternoon. Who's your smoky for a maybe 3rd row, 4th row? Beside those top 2 teams, beside Ferrari and Red Bull, I've got one, but I'm going to ask you first. Who do you see maybe sort of getting into the top 6 and would be, wow, someone's in the top 6? What do you think?
So smoky, 3rd row, 4th row. Yeah. Probably a Ferrari engine in the back of an Alfa Romeo. That'll be smoky, don't you think, by the end of qualifying?
Valtteri Bottas.
Valtteri Bottas. I think he's had the pace all year, really. And he was thereabouts. I mean, he was just, what was he? I think he was 9th or 10th this afternoon.
Correct, this afternoon. He was 9th, yes.
Yeah, which is right around about the ballpark. I don't think Lando Norris is going to be on pole, so he'll drop back to around about that area. I think Valtteri Bottas appears very bankable at the moment. And I think that's where he belongs. But I think he will be behind by what we've seen Alpine. So I'm going to say Alpine ahead of Alfa Romeo.
To whom it may concern, he may say after he qualifies on the 3rd row, Michael. But I'm going to go for in the fast lane favourite Pierre Gasly to pull a lap out.
Oh, he's been a little bit quiet this weekend,
Being
though,
a
hasn't
little
he?
bit anonymous, but perhaps he's, let's go for a two-wheel analogy. He's doing the Marc Marquez, saving himself for one lap in Q2.
Let's hope that's the only, as far as he takes the Marc Marquez impersonation.
He's not going to high side out of the AlphaTauri. That'd be quite something. But
I'd be impressed.
Pierre Gasly spent that much of last year in P5 and P6 on the grid.
Yes.
Remarkable. Every single race, he'd just pull a lap out and he would be right there. But he's my tip. But look, we've certainly got a lot of action coming up in the next half an hour as we set the grid for the Australian Grand Prix for tomorrow. But that's where we're going to leave Saturday of In the Fast Lane live at the Australian Grand Prix. Coming up on Sunday from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m, we'll be joined up here on stage by a number of special guests as we build up to the main event, the 58-lap 2022 Formula One Heineken Australian Grand Prix. Until then, for Michael Lamonato, I'm Matt Clayton. Thanks for listening and join us next time for another lap in the Fast Lane.